I'll give you $1,000 if you serve me in French, the millionaire mocked. What she said changed everything. That sentence, spoken with arrogance, over a candlelit dinner at a Manhattan bistro, would change more than just one evening. It would change lives. Picture this, Lumiere Bistro, a small French restaurant tucked on the corner of Madison Avenue, buzzing with laughter, the sound of clinking glasses, and the aroma of butter and garlic drifting through the air. That night, a man named Etienne Morel, a millionaire with a taste for attention, sat at a corner table surrounded by his wealthy friends. Across the room, Claire Dubois, a waitress with quiet elegance and eyes that carried both exhaustion and grace, moved between tables, unaware that she was walking straight into the moment that would define her life. When Etienne called her over, his smirk said everything. His voice cut through the chatter. "I'll give you $1,000 if you serve me in French." The crowd laughed, thinking it was harmless fun, but Claire's silence that followed wasn't fear. It was the sound of dignity, calm, deliberate, and waiting to speak. What she said next, no one in that restaurant would ever forget. You see, sometimes life doesn't test our strength with tragedy or chaos. It tests us with humiliation, with the sting of being underestimated. And that's exactly what happened that night. Claire wasn't just a waitress. She was a woman who had studied French literature, raised her son alone, and worked tirelessly to build a life one paycheck at a time. Etienne thought he was tossing her a challenge, a joke to impress his friends. But in truth, he handed her a stage, and what she did with it turned arrogance into awe. This isn't just a story about pride or class. It's about something deeper. The quiet power of knowing who you are when the world tries to make you forget. If you've ever been looked down on, laughed at, or treated like you weren't enough, this story is for you. Because sometimes, all it takes is one sentence, one heartbeat, one act of courage to remind everyone, and yourself, that your worth isn't up for negotiation. Before we dive into this incredible story of resilience and redemption, take a second to become part of something meaningful. If stories like this make your heart race, if they remind you that strength can live in silence, subscribe to this channel, turn on the notification bell, and hit the like button. Because here, every story carries a heartbeat, and every lesson leaves a mark. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your country and city in the comments below. It's amazing to see how these stories reach hearts all around the world. So settle in, take a deep breath, and get ready. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary people deliver the most extraordinary truths. The hum of the city was always present, like a heartbeat beneath the glittering skin of New York. Inside Lumiere Bistro, the sound softened. Muted jazz flowed from hidden speakers, mingling with the quiet clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of polished conversation. The air smelled of butter, garlic, and ambition. Waiters in black aprons glided between tables like shadows trained to smile. And there, at the center of it all, was Claire Dubois. Her brown curls were neatly tied in a bun, though a single strand always escaped to frame her cheek. Her uniform was pressed, her shoes spotless, her movements graceful yet mechanical, rehearsed like a dancer repeating steps to a song she didn't choose. She carried trays with the poise of someone used to invisibility, but there was something about her eyes, soft, amber, and watchful, that hinted at stories far deeper than her quiet smile revealed. Every night, Claire arrived before sunset, when the bistro was still empty and silent. She would tie her apron, adjust her hair, and breathe in the scent of fresh baguettes from the kitchen. The restaurant's owner, Victoria Langley, demanded perfection. The napkins had to fold into sharp triangles. The silverware must reflect the chandeliers, and not a single candle could flicker unevenly. Claire followed every rule, though her mind often wandered far from the polished tables. Sometimes she imagined herself standing at the front of a classroom, teaching French literature, the language her mother used to lull her to sleep with. Her books from NYU sat on her nightstand at home, gathering dust like dreams she hadn't yet earned the right to open. She had left school 2 years earlier to care for her little brother, Elijah, after their mother's passing. It wasn't a sacrifice she regretted. It was simply life, written in the language of love and responsibility. Still, when the jazz dimmed and the last customer left, she sometimes whispered verses of Baudelaire under her breath, like a secret prayer no one could hear. Outside, the streets of the Upper East Side gleamed under the mist of a late October drizzle. Cabs honked softly, their lights reflecting against puddles that rippled like broken mirrors. Inside Lumiere, the evening crowd began to arrive. Executives with expensive watches, couples on anniversaries, and the occasional celebrity hiding behind oversized sunglasses. Claire weaved between them, taking orders with a calm tone that disguised the exhaustion in her bones. Yet every good evening she offered was genuine, touched by a warmth that wasn't taught. It was lived. She had learned long ago that kindness was a quiet kind of armor. And in a city that often forgot your name, a sincere smile could still change the air around you. What Claire didn't know was that tonight, amid the soft glow of candles and the hum of polished laughter, her world, so carefully balanced between grace and survival, was about to tilt forever. The night had unfolded with its usual rhythm, wine being poured, laughter rising, and the pianist at the corner weaving slow notes that made even time seem drowsy. Claire balanced a tray of Merlot and escargot, her posture upright, her mind on autopilot. The storm outside had intensified, streaks of rain tracing the tall windows like restless fingers. She had just delivered a plate to table 9 when Maria Gonzalez, the manager, leaned close and whispered, "New VIP at table 12. Be extra careful. He's one of those people who thinks the world revolves around his credit card." Claire smiled politely, the kind of smile that said, "I've seen worse," and made her way toward the new guests. At table 12 sat Etienne Morel, a tall man in a navy suit so sharply tailored it could have been cut from arrogance itself. His hair was dark and perfectly combed, his cufflinks gleamed with subtle gold, and his accent, when he laughed, rolled like French velvet dipped in superiority. He was joined by 3 business associates, all men who mirrored his polished confidence. Their laughter filled the air, too loud for the soft ambiance, too deliberate, as if to announce their importance. Claire approached with her notepad, maintaining the calm precision that had earned her quiet respect among the staff. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said. "Welcome to Lumiere. May I start you with some drinks?" Etienne turned toward her, his blue eyes sharp and playful. "Ah," he said, dragging the syllable like a tease. "You speak English well, but do you speak French, mademoiselle?" His friends chuckled, sensing a game brewing. Claire felt her stomach tighten, but her expression remained composed. "A little," she replied, her tone even. "I studied it once." Etienne leaned back, swirling his wine. "Then let's make it interesting," he said. "I'll give you $1,000 if you serve this entire table in French." His words hung in the air, half challenge, half mockery. The men around him laughed, one clapping the table as if it were the best joke he'd heard all week. For a moment, even the pianist's melody seemed to falter. Maria caught Claire's eye from across the room, silently mouthing, "Ignore it." The other guests began to glance over, curiosity stirring. Claire's pulse quickened, her throat dry. She had heard all kinds of condescension working in this place, slurred insults from drunk lawyers, snide remarks from uptown wives. But this was different. This wasn't just about her accent or her job. It was about dignity. And though she didn't know it yet, that single sentence, the careless arrogance of it, would ignite something deep inside her that would change everything. The laughter that followed Etienne's challenge cut through the room like a knife wrapped in silk. For a moment, Claire stood perfectly still, her notepad pressed against her palm, her chest rising and falling in quiet disbelief. She had heard insults before, subtle ones, often disguised behind polite smiles and hollow compliments. But this one was different. It was theatrical, deliberate, and meant to humiliate. The light from the chandeliers shimmered across the tablecloth, catching in the rim of Etienne's glass as he raised it slightly. like a toast to his own cruelty. Claire's throat tightened. The words, "I'll give you $1,000 if you serve me in French," echoed again, over and over, like a song she couldn't turn off. $1,000. Her mind did the math instinctively. That was almost her entire rent, Elijah's school supplies, maybe even enough to pay off the overdue electricity bill. But that wasn't the point, and she knew it. This wasn't generosity. It was spectacle. She felt her cheeks flush, the heat of shame crawling up her neck. The bistro, which moments ago had been a symphony of murmurs and music, suddenly seemed too quiet. Somewhere behind her, a fork dropped, the sound slicing through the tension like a gunshot. Claire forced a breath, tried to summon her professional smile, but her lips trembled. Her instinct told her to walk away, to let the comment slide, pretend it was nothing. She had spent years mastering the art of swallowing her pride. It had kept her safe. But as Etienne's laughter deepened, as his friends leaned in to enjoy the show, something inside her began to stir. A slow, quiet defiance that felt like the first flicker of fire after years of cold. She turned slightly, her shoes clicking softly against the polished floor as she walked toward the bar. Maria, the manager, was waiting there, her face pale and anxious. "Don't do anything stupid," Maria whispered as Claire approached. "You know who that man is? He's practically royalty in the hotel industry. He could ruin us with a phone call." Claire nodded, her hands trembling as she set the tray down. "I'm not going to do anything," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed herself. She could feel the weight of a dozen eyes following her, the curious guests, the other waiters pretending not to watch, even the pianist who had slowed his melody to a hesitant crawl. The air had changed. It was heavier now, thicker, filled with the invisible electricity that precedes a storm. Maria touched her arm gently. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just ignore him. He's not worth it." Claire wanted to agree. It was the logical thing to do, the safe thing, but logic and dignity rarely speak the same language. She closed her eyes for a second, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw Elijah, her little brother sitting at the kitchen table, repeating French phrases from the worn-out workbook she had bought at a thrift store. "Merci beaucoup, ma sœur," he had said one night, smiling with pride. "You sound like a real teacher." That memory hit her like a whisper from another life. She had once dreamed of becoming a French literature professor, of standing before a classroom full of eager students, but reality had demanded something else. Late-night shifts, sore feet, and the quiet acceptance that dreams don't pay bills. Still, that small spark, the part of her that had once loved words, culture, and pride, refused to die. And now, standing beneath the bistro's chandeliers, it flickered again. Her breath came slowly as she leaned against the counter, staring at her reflection in a polished wine glass. "You've survived worse," she reminded herself. "This is just another man with too much money and too little heart." But even as she thought it, she knew that wasn't true. This wasn't just another man. There was something more venomous about Etienne's arrogance, the effortless cruelty of someone who didn't even see the people he hurt. And that realization did something unexpected. It made her sadder than it made her angry, because she knew what it was like to live unseen. She had spent years blending into the background, becoming part of the furniture of other people's stories. Maybe that was why this moment hurt so deeply. It wasn't only about being mocked, it was about being reminded of how small the world expected her to remain. Claire exhaled, long and slow, the kind of breath that carried both surrender and resistance. She could walk away. She could pretend none of it happened. Tomorrow, the guests would forget. Etienne would move on to his next meeting, his next bottle of wine, his next display of ego. But she would remember, the shame would follow her home, linger while she made dinner for Elijah, hum quietly in her chest when she lay in bed. And that, she realized, was its own kind of defeat. So she stood there, torn between two versions of herself, the one who stayed silent to survive, and the one who wanted to speak to finally live. When she turned back toward table 12, her hands were still trembling. but her spine had straightened. The storm inside her wasn't gone. It was gathering, and deep down, she knew that the next time Etienne spoke, she wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. The rain outside had turned heavier, tapping against the tall windows of Lumiere Bistro like impatient fingers on glass. The streetlights cast streaks of gold through the downpour, blurring the city into a watercolor of motion. Inside, the restaurant was a small universe of contrast: warm light, polished laughter, and tension that hung invisible but dense. Claire stood near the bar, her thoughts tangled like the rain on the window pane. Maria's warning still echoed in her ears, soft but sharp. Don't do anything stupid. The older woman's voice carried years of experience, the kind of wisdom born not from books, but from scars. Maria Gonzalez had worked at Lumiere since the day it opened. Her face bore the calm of someone who had seen storms come and go, both in weather and in people. She moved toward Claire now, drying her hands with a napkin. I've known men like him all my life, she said quietly, her accent coloring her words. They don't challenge you because they're curious. They do it because they can, because the world has taught them that their money gives them permission. Claire didn't answer at first. She stared down at the counter, at the reflection of the wine bottle glimmering beneath the chandelier's light. Then what do you do? She finally asked. When they push you like that, Maria smiled sadly. You learn when to fight and when to walk away, but sometimes... She paused, folding the napkin in her hands. Sometimes walking away just means you'll keep being the one who's stepped on. Her eyes lifted, locking on Claire's. You're better than that, mija. You've got a fire in you. I see it. The words hit Claire in a place she hadn't expected. A place that still believed in herself, though barely. For months, maybe years, she had buried that fire under layers of politeness, professionalism, and exhaustion. Maria's gaze held steady, like a mirror she couldn't look away from. You remind me of me when I first came to this country, Maria continued, her tone softening. I used to wait tables at a fancy hotel downtown. One night, a man called me the help, just like that, like I wasn't a person. I smiled. I laughed. But when I went home, I cried so hard I couldn't breathe. That's when I promised myself I'd never let anyone make me feel small again. She leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't give that man what he wants, Claire. Don't let him define the size of your worth. The hum of the restaurant blurred around them, fading into the background. For the first time all night, Claire felt her pulse steady. Maria wasn't telling her to fight recklessly. She was reminding her that silence can be its own kind of surrender. And surrender had already cost Claire too much. A sudden burst of thunder outside seemed to punctuate the conversation, shaking the glassware along the shelves. Maria turned her gaze toward the dining room. You should go, she said quietly. He's watching you. Claire followed her eyes. Etienne Morel sat lounging in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass, his smile still painted with amusement. His associates leaned in close, whispering behind half-hidden smirks. Claire straightened her shoulders, feeling something shift inside her, something like gravity finding its true pull. You think it's worth it? She asked softly, her voice barely audible over the jazz piano. Speaking up. Maria didn't hesitate. Always, she said, even if your voice shakes. There was something in her tone, steady, certain, that ignited something deep in Claire's chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. She realized that Maria wasn't just her manager tonight. She was the voice she hadn't let herself hear for years, the reminder that courage doesn't need permission. Claire took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving Etienne's table. The laughter from that corner had grown quieter now, more curious than mocking. The stage was still his, but the silence that followed was starting to belong to her. And as she picked up her tray once more, adjusting her apron, she felt something rare, a calm that didn't come from safety, but from resolve. The kind of calm that precedes a choice that can't be undone. Claire stood still for a long moment before she moved again. The sound of rain outside had softened into a rhythm, steady, hypnotic, like the beating of her own pulse. The restaurant had resumed its usual elegance, but she could feel something different in the air now. A shift, invisible but undeniable. She could almost sense the way the other servers avoided glancing toward Etienne's table. How even the pianist hesitated before pressing the next key. That silence was its own kind of invitation. Claire felt her fingers brush against the edge of her apron, the fabric damp from the condensation of wine glasses she'd carried earlier. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the mirror behind the bar, and for the briefest second, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. There was a softness there still. Yes, but behind it, a glint of something stronger. Determination. Defiance. She took a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and turned toward the table. Maria's words echoed quietly in her chest. Don't let him define the size of your worth. As Claire approached, the noise of the restaurant seemed to dim, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Etienne leaned back in his chair, watching her with the lazy amusement of a man used to controlling every room he entered. His associates turned expectantly, their smirks faltering slightly as they saw the steadiness in Claire's eyes. The air shimmered with tension, delicate but unbreakable. When she stopped beside the table, she felt the weight of every gaze, every unspoken word. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply looked at him, meeting his eyes directly, refusing to be the silent backdrop of his performance. Then, in a voice so calm it startled even her, she said, Très bien, monsieur. Si vous voulez que je vous serve en français? Her accent was clear, graceful, undeniably fluent. Etienne's glass paused mid-air, his smirk faltering. Je le ferai, she continued, finishing the sentence with quiet finality. Very well, sir. If you want me to serve you in French, I will. The words rolled effortlessly, each syllable cutting through the stillness like the steady notes of a violin. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sound of rain returned faintly, the pianist's melody drifting back like a question waiting for its answer. One of Etienne's companions looked down at his napkin. Another shifted in discomfort. It was Etienne who broke the silence first, a thin smile curling his lips, though it lacked its earlier arrogance. So you do speak, he said softly. Impressive. But the tone had changed. It was no longer a challenge. It was the uneasy admiration of a man who realized the game had slipped out of his hands. Claire didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply took her pen and began writing their order, her words flowing in elegant, precise French. Her pronunciation was impeccable, her composure unshaken. Every sentence seemed to pull the room tighter around them, erasing the boundaries between humiliation and dignity. As she spoke, the laughter that had once filled the table vanished completely. Even Maria, watching from the bar, felt tears gather in her eyes. She had seen countless moments of humiliation in this business, but very few of redemption. And that night, Claire crossed an invisible line, not just between languages, but between who she had been and who she was becoming. She was no longer surviving. She was reclaiming herself, one syllable at a time. For the rest of that evening, time moved differently inside Lumière Bistro. The rhythm of clinking glasses and quiet jazz continued, but beneath it ran a current of something new, something charged. Claire's voice flowed with calm precision as she spoke French, not just serving the table, but reclaiming every word that had once been a dream left behind. Each phrase felt like a piece of her past returning to life. Souhaitez-vous un apéritif avant le dîner? Her tone was fluid, musical, confident. Etienne, once amused, now listened with a furrowed brow that betrayed discomfort. His associates avoided eye contact, their laughter silenced. For the first time that night, Claire wasn't the invisible waitress in the corner of the frame. She was the frame itself. The restaurant had shifted its center of gravity toward her, even if no one dared to acknowledge it aloud. Maria watched from behind the counter, pride and worry mixing in her chest. She knew this moment. She had lived it before. She also knew that standing up to power often came with a cost, and that courage in public sometimes invited punishment in private. But she said nothing. This was Claire's night, and it belonged to her in every way that mattered. As the night wore on, small tests began to unfold, as though the universe wanted to see how far Claire's newfound fire could burn. One of Etienne's friends, a man named Richard Palmer, attempted to regain control of the situation. "That was cute," he said, forcing a smile. "Now, how about you try something a little more difficult? Maybe the wine pairing in French, if you even know what that means." His tone was coated in sarcasm, the kind that pretends to be playful but stings like acid. Claire turned her gaze to him, and instead of shrinking, she answered in fluent, flawless French, naming every bottle on their table. The region, the flavor notes, even the vineyard's history. Each word landed with the precision of a poet, the grace of someone who didn't just memorize language but lived it. The table fell silent again. Maria caught a glimpse of something unexpected, Etienne's jaw tightening, not in anger, but in restraint. There was a flicker in his expression, a battle between pride and shame, though he hid it behind the rim of his glass. Claire's heart pounded, but she didn't falter. The more they tested her, the steadier her voice became. What began as humiliation had transformed into revelation. The walls that once confined her confidence had cracked wide open. Not everyone in the restaurant shared her triumph. Near the kitchen, a young busboy named Eddie whispered to another server, "She's gonna get fired for this, you know." It wasn't cruelty, it was fear. In places like Lumiere, where image was everything, defying a wealthy guest was an unspoken sin. But Claire wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. She was thinking about her mother, the woman who had once whispered poems of Victor Hugo to her at bedtime, who taught her that language wasn't just communication, it was power. The memory pulsed inside her like a second heartbeat. When she delivered their dessert, a perfect crème brûlée topped with raspberries, she did so with the same poise she had started the night with, but now every movement carried purpose. Etienne didn't look at her when he thanked her. His voice was quieter now, the arrogance stripped away, leaving something uncertain behind. As Claire walked away, Maria stepped forward, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You did good, chérie," she whispered. Claire smiled faintly, though the adrenaline still hummed in her veins. "I just couldn't let him win," she said softly. Maria shook her head. "You didn't just win, Claire. You reminded him that decency has a language too." Claire didn't answer. She simply looked toward the door, where the storm outside had finally eased. The city beyond glowed under wet reflections of neon and moonlight. A different kind of applause, silent but sincere. After the final table left and the last candle was blown out, Lumiere Bistro fell into a silence that felt almost sacred. The hum of the refrigerator in the bar was the only sound left, steady and soft, like the heartbeat of the place. Claire stood near the window, her reflection merging with the faint glow of the city beyond. Her body was tired, her feet ached, her hands trembled slightly, but her mind refused to rest. She replayed the night again and again, every moment like a film reel looping in her thoughts. Etienne's laughter, the mockery, the sudden hush when she spoke French, the way the entire atmosphere shifted as if someone had turned the world inside out. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like a background character in other people's stories. She had spoken, and the world had listened. And yet, as pride swelled quietly in her chest, something else lingered. Doubt. Had she gone too far? Would Maria's warnings come true? She could already imagine the owner hearing about the scene and blaming her for disrupting a valuable client. The thrill of dignity often came hand in hand with the fear of consequence. She wrapped her arms around herself, watching as the rain finally stopped outside. The city lights glistened on the slick pavement, cars whooshing by in a rhythm that almost felt like applause. Maria approached slowly, her heels clicking softly on the tile floor. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling up like thin ghosts in the dim light. "You did something brave tonight," she said, setting one down beside Claire. Not many people would have done that. Claire smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed fixed on the window. Brave or stupid, she murmured. Sometimes I can't tell the difference. Maria chuckled, the sound warm and low. They're cousins, she said, but only one of them lets you sleep at night. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. You should be proud. You didn't just stand up to him. You reminded everyone in this place that we're not props in someone else's show. Claire wanted to believe that. But as she took a sip of coffee, the bitterness on her tongue reminded her of reality. I might lose my job for it, she whispered. Maria nodded. Maybe, but you'll walk out with your head high, and that's something you can't buy, even with $1,000. The words struck deep, both comforting and frightening. Pride had its price, and she was about to learn exactly what it cost. Later that night, when she finally left Lumiere and stepped into the cool air, the city felt both alive and impossibly distant. Steam rose from the grates in the sidewalk, the smell of rain mixing with asphalt and late-night coffee from a nearby cart. She pulled her coat tighter around her and started walking home. Her apartment was only a few blocks away, but every step felt heavy, her thoughts tangled between victory and fear. She imagined Elijah asleep in their small apartment, the glow of his nightlight painting soft patterns on the wall. He had always believed she could do anything, that his sister was unbreakable. She didn't want him to see the cracks she carried inside. As she turned a corner, her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Whatever happens tomorrow, hold your head up. You changed something tonight. Claire smiled faintly, her eyes stinging. The words felt like a lifeline. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the world in fragments. Light, shadow, and color blending together. Somewhere in that reflection, she saw herself not as the quiet waitress who hid behind politeness, but as the woman who had dared to speak even when her voice shook. The city seemed to hum back at her in agreement, whispering that transformation often begins not with triumph, but with the trembling moment right after courage. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only the calm before the storm, the stillness before the real test began. Morning light filtered through the blinds of Claire's small apartment, slicing the dimness into thin bars of gold and gray. The world outside was waking up. Car horns, footsteps, the hiss of a coffee machine from the cafe across the street. But inside, time seemed to drag. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, holding a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at nothing. The night before felt like a dream and a warning at once. Elijah's laughter came from the kitchen as he poured cereal, oblivious to the storm brewing in his sister's chest. She envied that innocence, the way he could see her as unstoppable, as if nothing in the world could touch her. She had always protected that illusion for him, building it brick by brick, even when their lives had fallen apart after their mother's death. But today, she didn't feel unstoppable. Today she felt the weight of her defiance. A message from Maria blinked on her phone. He complained to Victoria, "She's calling you in today." Claire's heart sank. She had expected it, but the confirmation still hit like ice in her veins. She took a deep breath, set down the cup, and forced a smile for Elijah when he looked up. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Of course," she said. "Just a long day ahead." She didn't tell him that she might not have a job by sunset. He didn't need to carry that fear too. The walk to Lumiere Bistro felt longer than usual, though the city streets were the same. The drizzle from the night before had left puddles on the sidewalk, and each one seemed to mirror her uncertainty. By the time she arrived, her pulse had become an echo in her ears. Inside, the restaurant was still closed, the scent of coffee and bleach mingling in the morning air. Victoria Langley, the owner, stood near the bar in her pristine suit, posture sharp enough to cut glass. "Claire," she said without looking up from her tablet. "Sit." Claire obeyed, her palms cold against the surface of the polished table. Victoria finally met her eyes. "Do you have any idea who Etienne Morel is?" Her voice was measured, clipped. Claire nodded slowly. "A hotel executive," she said, "one of our top clients." "Exactly," Victoria replied. "He spends thousands here every month, brings his partners, his investors. He's part of what keeps this place open." She leaned forward slightly. Last night, he told me he was embarrassed, that you made a scene, that your tone was, how did he put it, defensive and inappropriate. The words stung more than she expected. I didn't mean to embarrass anyone, Claire said quietly. He mocked me. He offered me money to— I know what he did, Victoria interrupted, her tone sharp. But people like him don't apologize. They don't need to. We do. Claire stared at her, stunned. So, you're saying I was wrong to defend myself? Victoria sighed, setting the tablet down. I'm saying you were unwise. The silence that followed was heavy enough to press the air out of the room. Claire looked down at her hands, her knuckles pale from the tension. She had prepared herself for anger, for condescension, but not for disappointment. You're suspended, Victoria said finally. 1 week, without pay, maybe longer, depending on how the review goes. Claire felt her chest tighten, a mix of shame and fury tangling inside her. I understand, she whispered, though what she meant was, I can't believe this. Victoria's voice softened slightly, though not from compassion. You're a good worker, Claire. But this is a reminder. Our job is to serve, not to challenge. The words echoed cruelly, unraveling everything Maria had told her the night before. Claire stood slowly, her body trembling. I see, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. She turned toward the door, her eyes blurring as she walked out into the pale morning light. Outside, the city was awake now, impatient, unfeeling, beautiful. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure whether to cry or laugh. She had spoken with dignity, and yet here she was, punished for it. The irony stung like salt in an open wound. As she began walking home, the clouds above broke apart, sunlight spilling through like a cruel reminder that the world kept turning, indifferent to who fell and who stood tall. Claire's heart ached, not from regret, but from the bitter taste of truth. Courage didn't guarantee reward. Sometimes, it only gave you back yourself. The week that followed felt endless. The first few days, Claire moved through her apartment like a ghost, trapped between humiliation and numbness. The silence was heavier without the noise of Lumiere Bistro. No jazz, no chatter, no clinking of plates. Only the ticking of the old clock on the kitchen wall. Each tick seemed to whisper, you shouldn't have spoken. She tried to keep busy, cooking for Elijah, cleaning, filling out job applications online, but her mind always drifted back to that night. She replayed every word, every glance, wondering if she could have handled it differently, maybe if she had smiled more, maybe if she had walked away sooner. But the thought always ended in the same place. He was wrong, and no amount of self-doubt could erase that truth. One evening, while Elijah did his homework, she opened her old French literature notebook. The pages smelled faintly of paper and memory. In the margins were quotes she had copied from her university days. Lines from Victor Hugo, Simone de Beauvoir, and Camus. One stood out, underlined in blue ink. Invincible is the soul that refuses to bow. Her chest tightened as she read it, the words feeling like a hand reaching back through time to remind her who she was. That night, for the first time in days, she didn't feel small. She felt still, like the world was giving her space to remember. On the 6th day, Maria showed up at her apartment unannounced, holding 2 paper cups of coffee and a brown paper bag that smelled like pastries. You look like someone who forgot what sunlight is, Maria teased, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Claire laughed softly for the first time in a week. They sat at the small kitchen table, the one cluttered with Elijah's school books and unpaid bills. Maria's face was serious now. You did the right thing, Claire, she said. Don't let them make you think otherwise. Claire sighed. It doesn't feel like it. I lost my job. For now, Maria replied. But that's not the end. Etienne came back yesterday. Claire froze. He did. Maria nodded. He asked for you. Said he wanted to apologize. Claire blinked, disbelief washing over her. You're joking. I'm not. Maria said, leaning back. He said he thought about what happened and realized he'd crossed a line. He asked if you'd come talk to him. For a moment, Claire couldn't speak. She wasn't sure what stunned her more, the idea of him apologizing or the thought of facing him again. Her hands tightened around her cup. I don't know if I can, she admitted. Maria smiled gently. You don't have to forgive him. Just don't let fear decide for you. The words lingered long after Maria left, echoing in Claire's mind like a melody she couldn't shake. That night, as she watched Elijah fall asleep, she stood by the window, the city glowing softly in the distance. Somewhere out there, life was moving on. People laughing in restaurants, lights flickering across skyscrapers, stories unfolding in quiet corners. She realized something. Lumiere had never really been her whole world. It was just the stage where her courage first stepped into the light. What mattered now wasn't the job she lost, but the voice she found. She thought about what Maria had said, about Etienne's unexpected apology, and something inside her shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was understanding. People like Etienne didn't change easily, but maybe he had seen something that made him uncomfortable enough to reflect. And maybe that was the real reward, not validation from others, but the quiet strength of knowing you made someone think, even for a second. She closed her eyes, feeling the city breeze brush against her face through the open window. Tomorrow, she decided, she would go back to Lumiere, not to beg, not to reclaim her job, but to stand in that space again, this time without fear. The real reward wasn't money nor approval. It was reclaiming her story, her pride, and the truth that had always lived beneath her silence. And though she didn't yet know it, that decision to face what broke her was the first step toward everything that would change next. The next morning dawned brighter than the week before, a golden haze settling over the skyline as the city exhaled itself awake. Claire dressed slowly, choosing her clothes with the kind of care one gives to rituals that matter. She put on a soft white blouse and her cleanest pair of black slacks, nothing fancy but dignified. As she tied her hair back into its familiar bun, her hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just another shift at Lumiere Bistro. It was something else, something heavier, more symbolic. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't see the same woman who had been mocked or suspended. Her eyes looked clearer now, older in a way that didn't mean tired but aware. She thought of Elijah's face when she left that morning, the way he'd hugged her waist without asking why she had dressed for work again. He didn't need to understand. Children often sense courage more than they see it. On her way out, she passed the street vendor who sold coffee on the corner. He greeted her like he always did. Morning sunshine, and she smiled, realizing how grounding those tiny moments were, the kind that stitched ordinary life back together after it had been torn apart. By the time she reached Lumiere, the city was fully alive, taxis honking, dogs barking, snippets of conversation bouncing off the buildings. She paused outside the bistro, staring through the glass at the familiar interior that had once felt like a second home. The chandeliers glimmered, the linen was crisp, and the scent of roasted garlic drifted faintly from the kitchen. Everything looked the same, but she knew she had changed. Maria was already inside, setting up the tables, her hair pulled into a tight bun. When she saw Claire at the door, she smiled and hurried over. "You came," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." Claire took a breath and nodded. "Neither was I." Maria squeezed her arm. "He's here," she said softly. "Table 12. The number hit her like déjà vu. Of course it would be table 12, the stage of her humiliation and awakening. Claire hesitated, feeling a flicker of old fear, but she steadied herself. "It's just a conversation," she whispered under her breath. "I can do this." Maria gave her a look that was equal parts pride and concern, then stepped back, letting her go. The walk across the restaurant felt longer this time, not because of dread, but because every step carried the echo of what had happened before. The challenge, the defiance, the silence that had broken when she spoke. Etienne sat alone, dressed casually this time, his suit replaced by a gray sweater and open collar. He looked up when she approached, and for once there was no smirk. "Claire," he said, standing slightly, unsure whether to offer his hand. She nodded politely, keeping her tone neutral. "Mr. Morel." "Please," he said, "just Etienne." She sat across from him, the air between them heavy with unspoken things. For a long moment, neither spoke. The clatter of dishes and faint murmur of voices filled the background, but the world felt suspended. Finally, he exhaled. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I was arrogant, thoughtless. I thought it was a joke, but I realize now that it wasn't funny. It was cruel." Claire studied his face. He looked uncomfortable in his own skin, as if he'd been rehearsing those words for days. "You made me feel small," she said softly, "and you did it because you could." Etienne's jaw tightened, his eyes lowering. "You're right." Silence stretched again, and this time, Claire led it. She wanted him to feel the weight of it, to sit in the discomfort that women like her had been forced to swallow for generations. After a while, he said, "I've told Victoria I'll be withdrawing my complaint. I asked her to reinstate you if you still want the job." Claire blinked in surprise, but she didn't respond right away. "Thank you," she said eventually, "but I haven't decided yet." Her voice carried no anger, only calm certainty. Etienne nodded slowly. "Whatever you choose, I hope you know you were right to speak up. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning." And as she rose to leave, the weight she had carried all week seemed to ease, like fog lifting after a storm. When Claire stepped out of Lumiere that afternoon, the sky was painted in shades of pale blue and fading gold. The city hummed around her, the kind of steady rhythm that only New York could produce. The laughter of strangers, the screech of brakes, the chorus of 1,000 lives colliding in perfect chaos. She paused for a moment at the corner, her reflection caught in the bistro's window behind her. For the first time in months, she didn't look like she was carrying someone else's weight. Her shoulders were straight, her steps light, her gaze clear. The conversation with Etienne had been awkward, yes, and raw in its honesty, but it had stripped something false from the world. Forgiveness wasn't easy, it rarely is, but she had discovered something better: freedom. He had apologized not because she demanded it, but because her courage had exposed the truth that had been hiding behind his arrogance. And somehow, that mattered more than vengeance. The city wind tugged gently at her hair, and she smiled at its touch. It felt like the universe exhaling beside her, a quiet acknowledgement that she had crossed a threshold no one could reverse. She stopped by the coffee cart where she usually bought her morning cup. The old vendor, Mr. Patel, recognized her instantly. "Long time, Miss Claire," he said, handing her a cup before she even asked. "Haven't seen that smile in a while." She laughed softly, handing him a few crumpled bills. Maybe it just needed some rest. He nodded knowingly. Sometimes even brave people forget they're brave. His words lingered with her as she walked away, steaming cup in hand, blending into the steady pulse of pedestrians along Madison Avenue. She watched people rush by, some frowning into their phones, others laughing in clusters of 2 or 3, and realized that everyone was carrying something invisible: fear, pride, hope, shame. She wasn't alone in her struggle. She was simply one voice in a vast, unending symphony of resilience. That thought grounded her more than anything else could. As she passed a bookstore, her gaze caught on a display in the window, a new translation of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. The sight made her stop, smile, and push the door open. The smell of paper and ink greeted her like an old friend. She walked to the counter, bought the book with the last $20 in her wallet, and held it close as she stepped back into the sunlight. The cover gleamed faintly, as if reflecting a version of her mother's voice whispering, "You are becoming who you were meant to be." That night, Claire sat by the window of her apartment, a soft lamp illuminating the pages of the book in her lap. Elijah slept soundly in the next room, his rhythmic breathing a small comfort in the quiet. She traced her finger over a passage that spoke of redemption and dignity. of light that survives even in the darkest hearts. Outside, the city glowed like a constellation brought down to earth, every window a story, every street a heartbeat. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped by her circumstances. She didn't feel small or invisible. She felt alive, completely, profoundly alive. What she had endured had not broken her. It had remade her. The humiliation, the fear, the silence. All of it had become the forge where her strength was born. She realized that resurrection isn't always loud. It isn't always fireworks or applause. Sometimes it's quiet, a steady flame rekindled in the chest of someone who finally remembers her worth. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and whispered softly to the night, "Merci." Thank you. Not to Etienne, not to fate, but to herself. For surviving, for speaking, for standing tall in a world that often asks women to kneel. And as the city murmured beneath her window, Claire Dubois, waitress, dreamer, survivor, finally felt whole. Few weeks later, the rhythm of life had found its way back into Claire's days, but this time, it moved differently, slower, more deliberate, like a melody she was finally composing for herself. The air was crisper now, autumn sneaking into the corners of New York City. Leaves swirled around her feet as she walked Elijah to school in the mornings, his laughter cutting through the chill like sunlight. She no longer hurried through those moments, no longer lived inside the rush of survival. There was peace in her steps now, the peace that comes from knowing you faced something dark and walked out the other side without losing your light. She had decided not to return to Lumiere Bistro. Victoria had called twice, offering her position back, but Claire had declined gently. "Some doors," she'd said, "are meant to stay closed after you've learned your lesson inside them." Instead, she had started teaching beginners French classes at a small community center in the East Village. Nothing glamorous, but it filled her soul in ways that tips and long shifts never could. Her students adored her, retirees, immigrants, single moms trying to learn for better jobs. They called her Madame Claire, and every time one of them mastered a new phrase, she felt a quiet spark of purpose. Life wasn't easy, money was still tight, rent still loomed, but it finally felt hers. One evening, after class, she lingered near the old bistro out of curiosity. The window display had changed. New staff, new decor, even a new manager's name printed on the door. Yet, through the glass, she saw something familiar. Etienne, seated near the window, alone with a cup of espresso and a small notebook. He looked different now, calmer, humbler somehow. Their eyes met for the briefest second. He smiled faintly and nodded, not as a superior, not as a man who once mocked her, but as one human acknowledging another who had taught him something he couldn't unlearn. Claire returned the nod and kept walking. There was nothing left to prove, no bitterness to carry. In that brief exchange, forgiveness passed silently between them, not in words, but in understanding. As she turned the corner, she caught her reflection in a shop window, coat buttoned, head high, eyes steady. For a moment, she saw the same dignity she had once fought to defend reflected right back at her. The city lights blurred in the glass, making her look like she was glowing. Maybe, in a way, she was. That night, after dinner, Elijah climbed onto the couch beside her, clutching a picture he had drawn at school, a woman standing tall beneath a giant city skyline, holding a little boy's hand. "It's us," he said proudly, "and see the word on top." He pointed at the word written in his best attempt at cursive, respect. Claire's breath caught. She smiled, tracing the letters with her fingertip. "You spelled it perfectly," she whispered. He grinned and leaned against her shoulder. They sat there for a long time, watching the lights flicker through the window. Two souls who had weathered storms but found warmth in the same small apartment they had once feared losing. The world outside was still chaotic, still unpredictable, but inside there was peace. Later, when Elijah fell asleep, Claire stood by the window again, looking out over the city that had both broken and rebuilt her. Somewhere out there, in another restaurant or another story, Someone else was probably facing their own version of humiliation, fear, or injustice, and maybe, just maybe, her story would reach them. A reminder that dignity doesn't need permission, and that even in silence, truth can roar. She whispered softly to the night, as if sending the words out into the world. Merci pour la lumière. Thank you for the light.